Prepare yourself. You are about to hear a story you won't find in any official military chronicles. It is absent from the memoirs of generals and the maps of staff headquarters. This story is a whisper, carried to us from the darkest days of April 1945. It is the story of the last, desperate breath of a doomed city. A story of old men who had already seen one lost war and of boys from whom the war had stolen their childhood. This is the story of how a Volkssturm battalion, the last army of the Reich, held the defense of an abandoned factory on the outskirts of Berlin for 5 days. April 27th, 1945. The fourth day of the defense, bleeding into the fifth, the vast assembly hall of the Nordbau factory no longer resembled a creation of human hands. It had become like the ripped open ribcage of a leviathan, where mangled steel trusses jutted out like ribs, and through the torn wounds in the roof seeped not sunlight, but a grey, lifeless emulsion of morning fog. In these pillars of ghostly light, thick with concrete dust, soot, and what seemed to be the very vapors of despair, ash swirled slowly. The air was so dense you could cut it with a knife, smelling of burnt iron, acrid gunpowder, rancid machine oil, and something else. Something cloyingly sweet, nauseating. The smell of baked blood and filth that had seeped into the very molecules of this cursed place. Behind a barricade of overturned lathes, resembling the fallen idols of a forgotten industrial religion, stood the frozen figure of an old man. His name was Klaus Richter, 63 years old. His face, carved with deep wrinkles like a field with trenches after an artillery barrage, was utterly still. He hadn't slept for nearly 3 days, and his faded gray-blue eyes stared into the void, yet saw something more. He saw the mud and stench of the trenches at Verdun, the green clouds of chlorine gas crawling across no man's land, the faces of long-dead comrades whose names he still whispered in his sleep. He looked upon this new hell and compared it to the old one, trying to understand what had changed in the world in 30 years, besides the caliber of the shells and the speed at which boys died. His fingers, gnarled with arthritis and decades of carpentry work, clutched the cold, sweat-polished wood of an old Mauser in a death grip. The weapon was almost as old as he was. Beside him, curled into a ball under a torn, damp-smelling greatcoat, slept a boy. Erich Bauer, 16 years old. His sleep was shallow, fitful. He whimpered, twitched, his lips whispering incoherent words, fragments of orders, his mother's name, the name of a friend who had died in his arms yesterday. In his sleep, his face, which had not yet lost its boyish softness, was contorted by a grimace of such suffering that Klaus wanted to wake him, to pull him out of this nightmare. But he knew. Reality was even more terrifying. The old man looked at the sleeping Erich, at his light hair, matted with dirt, at his thin, vulnerable neck, and saw in him not a soldier of the Reich's last army, but a ghost. The ghost of himself from 1914, just as frightened, just as enthusiastic, and utterly unprepared for what the war would do to his soul. Somewhere far away, beyond their concrete sarcophagus, Soviet artillery boomed, dull, methodical, like hammer blows on an anvil. Each impact sent a low-frequency tremor through the floor, through the steel structures, through their teeth. It was a funeral march for Berlin, and this march was counting down the final hours of their lives. But to understand how a veteran of the Great War and an enthusiastic youth from the Hitlerjugend ended up locked in this personal hell, how a handful of the doomed turned an abandoned factory into a death trap, we must go back 5 long, eternal days. To the very day their world, already cracking at the seams, shattered into a million incandescent fragments. April 22nd, 1945. A Volkssturm assembly point in a former gymnasium in Karlshorst. The spring air, which should have smelled of blooming lilacs and hope, was thick with anxiety and the distant scent of burning. Picture the scene, this grotesque theater of the absurd. Tall, echoing school corridors with parquet floors polished by generations of students. On the walls, naive children's watercolors, houses with neat fences, blue rivers, smiling suns, and beneath these symbols of a world gone forever, The last army was gathering. Old men who belonged on a park bench with a newspaper, not in formation. Many wore threadbare civilian coats and hats, from under which gray hair peeked out. Their faces were calm, but it was the calmness of stone. Veterans of that other forgotten war, they watched the commotion around them with a quiet, all-knowing contempt. They had seen empires fall before. Beside them were the boys, children, really, with peach fuzz on their upper lips in ill-fitting Hitler Youth uniforms. Sleeves too short, shoulders too broad. On their heads, oversized steel helmets that slid down over their eyes, making them look like mushrooms. They tried to act like men, making noise, shoving each other, clumsily lighting cigarettes, but in their wide, feverishly bright eyes, primal fear swam. Among them was Eric Bauer, lanky and thin, with a shock of unruly blonde hair. He stood hugging his clumsy French carbine, trying to still the trembling in his knees. Next to him, his friend Leo, a sturdy, red-cheeked boy, was whispering something funny in his ear, but Eric didn't hear. He was staring at the stage of the assembly hall where, under a massive portrait of the Führer, Gauleiter Herzog was pacing, a short, flabby man with the damp, darting eyes of a predatory rat. "The walls of Berlin will be the grave of the Asiatic hordes," he shrieked, his voice cracking into a squeal. "Every house will be a fortress, every stone will shoot. The spirit of Frederick the Great is with us. One of our Faustpatronen is worth 10 of their tanks." He spoke of indomitable spirit, but he himself flinched at every nearby explosion. Klaus Richter stood apart by a tall, Gothic window. He wasn't listening. He took a small, smoothly polished river stone from his pocket, an artifact from a past life. His wife, Martha, had found this stone on the bank of the Spree on their last Sunday together. She had laughed and said it looked like a heart. Now Martha was gone, and the stone was just a stone. Cold and heavy, like the grief in his soul. He looked at the boys, at their bravado, and remembered himself. August 1914. Flowers, marching bands, faith in a quick victory. And then, the first assault. The screams of the wounded, the smell of blood and excrement, and the realization that everything you had believed in was a lie. Eric approached him. "Herr Unteroffizier, is it true they're sending us to the Nordbau factory? Leo says it's the most important position on the entire front." Klaus turned slowly, hiding the stone in his fist. He looked into the boy's clear, frightened eyes and couldn't bring himself to tell him the truth. That any position becomes the most important one if you're ordered to die there for no reason. He only placed his heavy, calloused hand on the boy's bony shoulder. "Stay close to me, son, and stick with your friend. In battle, nothing is more important than the man to your right and your left. As for what they're shouting from the stage, it's just wind." At that moment, Gauleiter Herzog, appointed commissar of their strange battalion, finished his speech with a scream, "For the Führer and Greater Germany." A few thin, uncertain rounds of applause broke out, immediately drowned by the roar of a nearby explosion. They were loaded into covered trucks. They drove through a dying city, through streets transformed into canyons of broken brick and twisted metal. Through holes in the canvas, Eric saw the sky. It was crimson, like an inflamed wound. They were heading to the front line, still believing they were going to defend their home, not understanding that their real enemy was not in the Russian tanks, but right here, beside them, in the cabin of the lead truck. And his name was not Stalin, but Gauleiter Herzog. Arriving at the Nordbau factory was like landing on a dead planet. A vast territory sprawling over several hectares, surrounded by a high concrete wall topped with barbed wire. The workshops, like gigantic sarcophagi, were connected by galleries and overpasses like a circulatory system. Everything was covered in a thick layer of gray dust. The machines in the workshops, visible through shattered windows, were frozen in unnatural poses like an army of golems caught off guard by a spell. The wind, the sole master of this place, howled through the empty spaces, making long, moaning sounds. Gauleiter Herzog, jumping out of his car, unfolded a map and began giving orders with the confidence of an idiot. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity and deadly for those who had to execute it. He ordered 2 companies of teenagers, including Eric's, to spread out along the entire factory perimeter and take up defensive positions along the wall. It was a front line nearly 2 kilometers, about 1.2 miles long. 200 boys against the whole world. The company of old men, the pensioners' militia, as Herzog contemptuously spat, was ordered to wait in the main assembly hall as a reserve. Klaus Richter, hearing this, just gave a bitter smile. Even a first-year corporal would have understood that such a defense would be broken in the first engagement. But arguing was pointless. The boys, spurred on by the shouts of their young commanders, rushed to carry out the order with an enthusiasm bordering on madness. They scraped at the frozen ground with bayonets and entrenching tools, digging shallow pits that wouldn't have saved them from a thrown rock. Erich and Leo dug side by side. Leo, panting, told a joke, and Erich laughed. And for a moment it seemed like just a game, just training exercises. And then the game ended, abruptly, without warning. From around a bend in the road came the growing roar of a diesel engine, and soon a Soviet BA-64 armored car rolled onto the square in front of the main gates, followed by a truck full of infantry. A routine reconnaissance in force. But for the untested boys, it was the appearance of an armored angel of death. Someone screamed, a high, girlish sound. And that was enough. Panic, like a wildfire, instantly swept through their thin line. Herzog, instead of giving the command to arms, drew his Walther and, with a face twisted by a mix of fear and sadistic glee, bellowed, "Charge, forward, destroy the Bolshevik scum, for the Führer." And the unthinkable happened. Drugged by months of propaganda, deafened by fear and this insane order, the boys leaped from their shelters and with cries of "Heil!" charged forward across the open bullet-swept square, straight towards a heavy machine gun. Klaus, standing at the workshop gate, froze, unable to believe his eyes. He saw the machine gun on the armored car come to life, spitting a fiery tracer. The sound was like thick canvas being torn apart. And that canvas was woven from the lives of children. They fell. Not gracefully, not like in the movies, stumbling, dropping their rifles, clutching their stomachs, their faces, their death cries mixed with the crack of gunfire and the whine of ricochets. Erich ran with the rest. The world around him narrowed to Leo's back, running ahead of him. He saw his blonde hair, his broad, confident shoulders, and suddenly the shoulders jerked, an ugly red flower bloomed on his back, and Leo, his friend Leo, simply vanished, falling face forward. Erich tripped over his body and collapsed. He lay there, stunned, and watched as Soviet soldiers jumped from the truck, methodically, without fuss, taking up positions and firing with precision. Terror, cold and paralyzing, seized him. He couldn't get up, couldn't crawl. He just waited for a bullet. And at that moment, a body slammed heavily onto the ground beside him. A hand, strong as a steel vise, grabbed him by the collar. It was Klaus. Without a word, grunting with effort, the old man dragged him like a sack of potatoes, taking cover behind the bodies of his dead comrades, towards the saving shadow of a huge hydraulic press. Bullets snapped past, striking sparks from the asphalt. By the time they reached cover, it was over. The Soviet reconnaissance unit, having ascertained they were facing only a poorly organized militia, withdrew as quickly as it had appeared. On the square lay about 40 bodies in Hitler Youth uniforms. Their first charge had been their last. The catastrophe was absolute. When the rumble of engines faded, a new, terrible silence descended on the factory. It pressed on the eardrums. There was no peace in it, only the ringing echo of death. It was broken only by the quiet, plaintive groans of the wounded, scattered across the square like broken dolls. The surviving boys, shell-shocked and dazed, slowly crawled out from behind cover. Their faces were coated in a layer of gray dust, through which a deathly pallor showed. Their eyes, which just 20 minutes ago had burned with fanatical fire, were now empty, like the shattered windows of this factory. In 10 minutes, they had learned more about war than in all their years of propaganda. Eric sat, leaning against the cold metal of the press, which vibrated with the horror he had just experienced. His body was racked by violent, uncontrollable shudders. He looked at his hands, stained with earth and Leo's dark, rapidly thickening blood. He tried to cry, but he couldn't. The grief was so immense it couldn't pass his throat. Beside him, Klaus methodically, click by click, was loading a clip. His movements were unhurried, measured. There was something hypnotic in his calmness. Gauleiter Herzog stood in the middle of the square, over the bodies. He had recovered from the initial shock, and now his face was twisted into an ugly grimace of rage. "Cowards! Deserters!" he shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "It's their own fault! They have shamed the sacred banner." He ran up to the survivors, to the trembling, terrified boys, and shoved his pistol in their faces, demanding to know why they hadn't died like the others. A few old men from Klaus's company, ignoring the commissar, came out of the workshop with stretchers to collect the wounded. Herzog tried to stop them, screaming that the Reich had no need for cripples. It was at that moment that Klaus Richter realized their main enemy was not the Russians. The main enemy was here, in the middle of the square, and if he wasn't stopped, he would kill them all. The old man slowly stood up. He walked over to Herzog, who was shaking a crying 14-year-old boy by the lapels. Klaus placed his heavy hand on the commissar's shoulder. "Shut up, Gauleiter." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it had the hardness of granite. "You've said enough, and done enough." Herzog spun around. His face turned purple with rage. "What did you say, you old goat? I'll have you court-martialed." He raised his pistol. But Klaus didn't even flinch. He looked directly into the commissar's darting eyes, and in his gaze was such an ancient, profound weariness and such cold contempt that Herzog involuntarily lowered his arm. "Get your men off this damn square before the Russians plaster us with mortars. The wounded, to the basement of the administration building. The rest, to the assembly hall. Move." He wasn't speaking like an Unteroffizier. He was speaking like a man who had seen real death and now feared neither it nor its petty, bustling servants. And the men, exhausted, having lost faith in everything, obeyed him. They sensed in him what they so desperately lacked. Not hysterical cruelty, but a calm, unshakable strength. Old men and teenagers, united in silent grief, began to carry the wounded and the dead. Herzog hissed something about firing squads and treason, but no one listened to him. His power, built on fear and lies, had evaporated in the smoke of the first battle. Power had shifted to the old carpenter, the veteran of Verdun. When the last of the wounded had been carried away, Klaus called Eric and a few other boys over. He looked into their empty eyes. "Now listen to me. Forget everything they taught you. War is not about glorious charges. War is the art of hiding, the art of waiting, and the art of killing so you don't get killed. Our job is not to die here with fine words on our lips. Our job is to survive, to hold out as long as we can. Do you understand me?" They nodded silently, like automatons. In the gathering twilight, to the accompaniment of the ever-approaching cannonade, they barricaded themselves in the vast assembly hall that was to become their fortress, their tomb, and their only chance for salvation. That night, a cold April rain turned to freezing sleet. It drummed furiously on the metal roof of the hall, drowning out the groans of the wounded. Inside the enormous, echoing space, like the innards of a dead whale, a damp cold and darkness reigned. A few dim emergency lights, connected to an old diesel generator, barely pushed back the gloom, snatching groups of men huddled around fires and rusty barrels from the darkness. The smoke from the damp wood stung their eyes, mixing with the smell of sweat, blood, and fear. Fear was the primary inhabitant of this place. It sat in everyone, like a splinter in the heart. Klaus Richter did not sleep. He understood that fear had to be tamed, channeled in the right direction, or it would devour them from within. Along with a few other veterans, as gray and silent as himself, Klaus roamed the labyrinth of the workshop. With a flashlight in hand, he studied the place not as a soldier, but as a carpenter, as a designer. He didn't just see machines and conveyor belts. He saw perfect firing positions, ready-made barricades, hidden passages. And gradually, in his mind, accustomed to order and logic, a plan began to form. Not a plan for a heroic defense, but for a cunning, rat-like war. In the morning when the rain stopped, he gathered all the survivors. There were just over 200 of them. He spread a yellowed, mold-smelling engineering blueprint of the factory on a huge table. "We are not going to sit here like sheep in a pen." His voice was hoarse from lack of sleep, but firm. "We will turn this factory into a meat grinder, into one big death trap." He began to explain. His plan was audacious and simple. They would not hold the perimeter. They would lure the enemy inside, into the labyrinth of workshops, where heavy equipment would become clumsy and vulnerable. He divided everyone into small, mobile groups of 3 or 4, hunter-killer teams. Each team had its own sector, its own burrow. Their task was not to engage in firefights. Their task was to strike from ambush and immediately disappear into the shadows. Their main weapon would be the Faustpatronen. Klaus picked up one of these clumsy projectiles and began his lesson. "This is a fool's weapon if you fire it at the front of a tank," he said, tracing the diagram of a T-34 he had drawn in chalk on the floor. "The armor there is thick, but if you hit it in the side, under the turret or in the rear, where the engine is, it will turn into a coffin on tracks. The main thing is patience. You must let it get so close that you can smell its diesel. 30 meters, about 100 feet. No further. You fire, and you leave immediately. Don't wait to see what happens. Understood?" The boys listened to him, holding their breath. This was not the pompous babble of Herzog. This was the science of survival. The Gauleiter, watching from a dark corner, curled his lips in contempt. "Rat tactics! Unworthy of a German soldier." But no one paid him any attention anymore. The men, given a clear, understandable task, began to move. They started dragging crates, toppling machines, building barricades in the most unexpected places, leaving only narrow, pre-sighted passages. Their work was feverish, but purposeful. The fear hadn't gone away, but now it had a job to do. It transformed into a vicious, focused energy. By evening, the factory was unrecognizable. It had become a gigantic multi-level death trap, where death lurked around every corner, in every shadow. Eric, along with 2 other boys, Karl and Hans, set up a position on the second tier, on a shaky gantry above a conveyor belt. They had 3 Faustpatronen and a machine gun. From here, the entire central passage was a killing zone. Eric could feel his heart pounding, but it was no longer a paralyzing terror, but the thrill of a hunter. They waited, all night, and at dawn on the second day, they came. April 24th began with a fog as thick as cotton. It concealed the traces of yesterday's battle, muffled sounds, and created an illusion of peace. But it was the silence before a predator's leap, and the predator leaped. First, the ground began to tremble slightly. Then came a low, guttural roar that seemed to rise from beneath the earth, and out of the white veil of fog, like prehistoric monsters, 3 shadows emerged. 3 T-34 tanks. They moved slowly, almost stealthily, their long barrels swiveling from side to side like trunks. Behind them, at a respectful distance, infantry advanced in short bursts. Eric's mouth went dry. A diagram on the floor was one thing. This living, breathing steel embodiment of war was another. The Faustpatron in his sweaty hands felt like it was made of lead. Hans, next to him, let out a soft moan. "Steady," hissed the radio Klaus had salvaged from a burned-out staff car. "All teams, do not fire without my command. Let them enter the hall. Remember what I told you." "Wait!" The old sergeant's voice was cold as ice, and that coldness helped to cool their panic. The tanks, meeting no resistance, passed through the gates and entered the compound. They split up. One, the lead tank, moved directly towards the wide-open gates of the assembly hall. The other two began to slowly circle it from the flanks. The infantry hit the dirt and opened a blistering but inaccurate fire on the windows. Bullets whined and ricocheted off the walls. The lead tank crawled slowly into the gloom of the hall. Its tracks ground over broken glass and debris with a deafening clatter. It was like a blind giant in a china shop. It advanced 50 meters, 40, 30. From his position, Eric could see it perfectly. He could see the oil stains on its armor, the dents from old hits. He could almost feel its vibration. First and second groups. Target is in the hall. Fire, Klaus commanded. From two dark openings on the ground floor, two fiery tails erupted simultaneously, two thuds merging into one. One Faustpatronen hit the side, the second struck under the turret. There was a muffled internal explosion. The tank jerked, stopped, and thick black smoke poured from all its crevices. The turret hatch opened, and a burning man emerged. He screamed an inhuman cry. And then his scream was cut short by a brief burst of fire from a hiding spot. The tanks on the flanks, hearing the explosions, halted. The left one began to turn its turret toward the hall. "Third group, that's your target!" Another shot. The charge hit the track perfectly, immobilizing the vehicle. The crew opened fire wildly. "Fourth, fifth!" The tank on the right. The right T-34, realizing it was a trap, began to reverse at full speed. But it was too late. Two Faustpatronen slammed into its rear. It burst into flames like a matchbox. The remaining crippled tank continued to fire for some time, until the sixth group snuck up behind it and showered it with grenades. The infantry, deprived of their armor, retreated under machine gun fire, carrying their wounded. It was all over in 15 minutes. 3 Soviet tanks were burning in the factory grounds. The defenders had only 3 wounded. This was not just a victory. It was a miracle. It was confirmation that the old sergeant was a genius. When everything fell silent, shouts erupted in the hall. But they were not screams of terror. They were shouts of triumph. The boys, who just yesterday were weeping children, poured out of their hiding places, hugging, slapping each other on the back. They had done it. They, a bunch of forgotten rejects, had won. Eric looked at the burning machines, his body shaking from a mixture of pride, horror, and nausea. He had killed. They had all killed. Klaus Richter stood by a shattered window. He was not celebrating. He looked at the smoking wrecks and knew the Russians were not fools. They would not repeat their mistake. Next time they would come differently. But today, in this hour, they were victors. And in their small, besieged republic, a legend was born. The legend of the old men and children who knew how to slay dragons. Victory, even one so small and local, was intoxicating. It briefly banished fear and instilled in the boys' hearts a dangerous sense of their own invulnerability. But Klaus Richter quickly sobered them up. "They will be back," he said that evening as they gathered around fires to share a meager dinner. "And next time they won't come at us head-on. They will level this factory with artillery first. We don't have much time." Under his leadership, life in the factory finally transformed into that of an anthill preparing for a long winter. The guard shifts were tightened. Stalker teams were created, which moved like ghosts through the grounds at night, collecting weapons from the dead, searching warehouses for canned food, medical supplies, anything that might be useful. In one of the utility rooms, they stumbled upon a real treasure. Several crates of anti-tank mines and 2 crates of potato masher hand grenades. Their defensive capabilities increased tenfold. Schroeder, the medic, an old man with the face of a kind gnome, set up a makeshift infirmary in the deepest basement. He worked miracles, using torn shirts for bandages and moonshine, which they found in the guard's hut for antiseptic. Eric continued to write in his diary. It was no longer just a notebook. It was the chronicle of their state. He recorded everything. Who was on which post, how many rounds were left, Who had dreamt of home that night? His entries became the collective memory of their small, doomed world. They had created a system. They had created order in the midst of absolute chaos. But every system gives rise to those who wish to destroy it. Gauleiter Herzog had not accepted his demotion. Stripped of real power, he had become a venomous spider, weaving his web in the darkest corners of their shelter. He found his audience, a few of the youngest, most fanatical boys whose minds had been irrevocably warped by propaganda. He would gather them and whisper, whisper, whisper. "This Richter is a traitor," he would hiss, his small eyes burning with an unhealthy fire. "He's a coward from that war, the lost war. He wants to sit it out, wait for the Bolsheviks, and hand us all over. A true Aryan must seek death in battle. The Führer expects a feat of heroism from us, not this rat-like scurrying." He played on the most delicate strings of their young, tormented souls, on their sense of duty, on their fear of appearing to be a coward. The tension grew. It became almost palpable. The two centers of power, Klaus's cold, pragmatic reason and Herzog's fanatical madness, could not coexist in the same space for long. Klaus knew about the conspiracy. His old men were his eyes and ears. He could have crushed this viper's nest at any moment. But he waited. He wanted everyone to see the rot with their own eyes. He understood that he had to cut out this cancer by the root, or it would poison them all. The climax came on the third day. The culmination of the internal conflict came not from betrayal, but from conscience. One of the boys drawn into Herzog's plot, a 15-year-old named Kurt, couldn't bear it. That night, he approached Klaus, who was dozing by the radio. The boy was trembling. Stammering, he told him everything. That Herzog and 4 other teenagers were planning to kill the old sergeant in his sleep that very night. Then they would declare him a traitor who had wanted to sell them out, and at dawn, lead everyone in a final, desperate charge across the minefield, straight into the Russian machine guns. It was the plan not of a warrior, but of a madman craving collective suicide. Klaus listened in silence, his face impassive. When Kurt finished, the old man only placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, son. You acted like a true soldier. Now go to sleep and pretend this conversation never happened." That same night, as the factory sank into an uneasy sleep, Klaus and 3 of his most loyal veterans, as silent as shadows, approached the corner of the workshop where the conspirators had gathered. They heard Herzog's excited whisper as he described how their heroic deaths would be recorded in the annals of history. Suddenly, from all 4 sides, rifle bolts clicked. "It's over, Gauleiter." Klaus's voice sounded like a death sentence in the night's silence. Herzog and his followers jumped up. The Gauleiter tried to draw his pistol, but a veteran named Friedrich, a former farmer with hands like shovels, knocked the weapon from his grasp with a single blow from his rifle butt. The boys, seeing the barrels aimed at them, immediately dropped their carbines. Only Herzog refused to give up. "Traitors, you will hang for this," he shrieked. "History will curse you." Klaus walked right up to him and looked into his eyes. "There is no history here, Herzog. It's over. There are only these children, and it is my duty to save them, even from themselves, and especially from you." What happened next, Eric described in his diary with a single sentence. That night, the commissar and his men went on a mission. No one asked any questions. In the morning, when Klaus announced it, everyone was silent. But in their eyes, there was relief. The surgical operation to remove the cancerous tumor had been successful. Their small state had been saved from the enemy within. But while the surgeon was at work, a storm was gathering outside. On the morning of April 26th, the 4th day of the defense, hell began. The earth trembled, the sky shattered. A storm of artillery preparation fell upon them. Hundreds of shells and mortars. This was no longer a battle. It was the end of the world. The artillery bombardment was like the work of a gigantic jackhammer, turning their world to dust. Shells tore through the roof and tons of twisted metal and concrete fell into the workshop. The walls cracked and crumbled, the air became hot, thick, impossible to breathe. The roar was so intense it felt like it was tearing the brain apart from the inside. Men pressed themselves to the floor, crammed themselves into the deepest crevices, covering their heads with their arms. Erich lay under the press next to Klaus and wept, silently, his whole body shaking. It was not a cry of fear, but of helplessness, of the understanding that you are just a grain of sand in this fiery hurricane. Klaus lay with his eyes closed, his lips barely moving. He was counting. He knew this rhythm. He knew that after this fiery baptism there would be a short pause, and in that pause, the infantry would come. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the barrage ceased. A dead, ringing silence fell in which only the crackle of fire and someone's thin, high-pitched moan could be heard. "To your positions." "Now," the radio rasped. The men rose like ghosts, their faces gray with dust. Many were dazed, stumbling. Some were wounded by shrapnel. But like automatons, they took their posts. The discipline hammered into them by the old sergeant kept them on their feet. They saw them through the breaches in the walls. This time, it was not a raid. It was a methodical assault. Dozens, if not hundreds, of Soviet soldiers were attacking under the cover of the few remaining tanks and armored vehicles. They moved skillfully, in rushes, pouring fire into every window, every crack. The battle began. A battle for every meter. The defenders of the factory fought with the fury of the doomed. The mines laid during the night blew up tanks. Faustpatronen flew from the most unexpected places. Machine guns, set up deep within the hall, created crossfires, turning passages into corridors of flame. But the attackers were not novices either. Tank cannons fired point blank, destroying barricades. Snipers methodically picked off the defenders. Soon, Soviet soldiers stormed inside. Fighting broke out in the labyrinths of the workshop. The roar of gunfire mixed with the screech of metal, with shouts in Russian and German. Erich fired his carbine until the barrel glowed red. He was no longer thinking. He just saw a gray figure, aimed his rifle and pulled the trigger. Beside him, Hans fell, the boy with whom he had shared his first Faustpatrone. A bullet had hit him in the neck. He gurgled and fell silent. The fight descended into hand-to-hand combat. The old men, the veterans of Verdun, fought with bayonets and rifle butts with such a primal fury that young Soviet soldiers retreated before them. This was their last battle, and they poured all their pain, all their hatred for the war that was stealing everything from them for the second time in their lives, into it. By evening, as the sun began to set, painting the smoky sky in bloody hues, the assault faltered. Having suffered heavy losses, the Soviet units withdrew to regroup. Technically, the defenders of the factory had won again. They had held their fortress, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Surveying his ranks, Klaus knew it was over. Of the 200 men who had met the attack that morning, no more than 70 remained on their feet. Almost all were wounded. Ammunition was nearly gone. Only 2 Faustpatronen were left. They had repelled the assault, but they knew they would not survive the next one. This was the end. The night of April 27th was quiet. Horrifyingly quiet. There were no more groans from the wounded in the workshop. Those who could groan were already dead. The survivors lay silently, staring into the darkness. The men sat in their hideouts like animals in burrows, exhausted, burned out from the inside. They didn't talk. There was neither the strength nor the words. Each was having his final silent dialogue with God, with fate, with himself. Klaus Richter slowly walked through his dying garrison. He stopped by each one, silently shaking their hand, sharing a last crumb of tobacco. He looked into the eyes of these boys and saw in them a reflection of his own youth, consumed in the crucible of another war. He approached Erich. The boy was sitting, leaning against the frame of a huge machine, and by the light of a makeshift lamp made from a shell casing, he was writing something in his diary. His hand was shaking. "Writing your will, poet?" Klaus asked quietly without any irony. Erich looked up at him with his huge inflamed eyes. "A letter. To my mother. She's in Dresden." I know she'll never receive it, but I have to. I have to try to explain." He fell silent and a single tear rolled down his dirty cheek. At that moment, something inside the old soldier finally broke. Not his will, no. The dam holding back his fatherly love and pity for these children broke. He would not let them die. Not like this. Not here. Not for this lost, betrayed idea. He made his decision, the hardest of his life. He went to the radio. "This is 347. Calling Russian command. I repeat, this is 347. We are ceasing resistance. We are ready to surrender." He repeated it over and over, but the only response was the crackle of static. Then he knew he would have to go himself. He found a piece of once white cloth and tied it to the barrel of his rifle. A few of the old men, his comrades in arms, stood up beside him, silently, without a single word. They understood everything. But the teenagers, those who could still stand, blocked his path. One of them, his eyes crazed with fanaticism, raised his rifle. "This is treason! We do not surrender! We will die with honor!" Klaus looked at them, and in his gaze was an immense, fatherly sorrow. "Honor, son, isn't about dying a pointless death. Honor is about living, to rebuild what we have destroyed, so that your children will never know what war is. You haven't even lived yet, and I have already died once, in that other war. Believe me, there is nothing glorious about it. Give me your weapons." His voice was quiet, but it contained such strength and such pain that the boys faltered. One by one, they lowered their rifles. Klaus gathered everyone who could walk. There were 68 of them, wounded, ragged, soot-blackened ghosts. He looked them over one last time. "Let's go," he said. And they walked out of their shelter, out of their concrete tomb that for 5 days had been their home. They walked out into the cold moonlit square, towards the unknown. They walked across the dead square, strewn with the bodies of their comrades and their enemies. They walked in silence, stumbling over debris. In front, like Moses leading his people from bondage, walked Klaus, holding the white flag high on his rifle. From the darkness, from behind the skeletons of burnt-out tanks, dozens of eyes watched them. Dozens of barrels were aimed at them, but there were no shots. When they reached the center of the square, a Soviet officer followed by several soldiers came out to meet them. "Stoi! Orужие бросай!" came the command in broken German. "Halt! Drop your weapons!" Those who still had rifles dropped them to the ground with a clatter. They were surrounded. The Soviet soldiers, weary men who smelled of war, looked at this strange procession with unconcealed astonishment. They had expected to find SS fanatics. Instead, they saw gray-haired old men and weeping, emaciated children. For these soldiers who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, this was just routine. Just another handful of prisoners. Another drop in the ocean of war. None of them knew, and none would ever know, about their 5-day odyssey. About the knocked-out tanks, the executed commissar, the little factory republic built on the edge of doom. Their incredible, desperate defense, their internal rebellion, their quiet act of defiance, all of it vanished into oblivion, invisible to the grand narrative of history. They were marched through a destroyed city that was already celebrating victory. They were placed in a filtration camp. The old were separated from the young. Klaus saw Eric for the last time through a barbed wire fence. The boy stood in a crowd of others like him, looking at him. There was neither hatred nor gratitude in his eyes, only a quiet, bottomless emptiness. Then their paths diverged forever. Klaus Richter, a veteran of 2 world wars, died 6 months later in a prisoner of war camp near Karaganda from typhus. He was buried in an unmarked mass grave. Most of the old men from his company did not survive that first winter in captivity. The fate of the boys varied. Some died in the camps, some returned home many years later, broken and hollowed out. Erich Bauer survived. He returned to Germany in 1949. He became an architect, just as he had dreamed. He built new, bright houses on the ruins. He had a family, children, grandchildren, but until his death in old age, he never told anyone, not even his wife, about those 5 days at the Nordbau factory. His diary was found only after he died. But the nightmares haunted him for the rest of his life. He dreamed of a burning tank of Leo's face and of the calm, sad eyes of the old sergeant who had taught him the most important thing, not how to die, but how to live. The story of the 347th Battalion never made it into the official chronicles. It was too inconvenient, too tragic, too human. It fit neither the heroic myth of the victors, nor the penitent narrative of the vanquished. The Nordbau factory was rebuilt. New machines hummed in its workshops. New generations of workers came. And over time, the memory of those events faded, bleached, turned to dust, settling on old blueprints in an archive. But legends do not burn. Among the old workers who came to the factory right after the war, a tale was told for a long time. They said that at night, when the workshops were empty, you could hear strange sounds in the oldest assembly hall, a soft creak, like footsteps, muffled voices, and sometimes the quiet weeping of a child. They said it was the souls of those boys and old men, the last defenders of the factory, still standing their eternal, pointless watch. This story became urban folklore, a soldier's legend passed down in whispers, like something sacred. It became an invisible monument not to war, but to man. A monument to the indomitable will of those who, thrown into the deepest hell, found the strength to create their own small world, their own laws, their own honor. They fought not for the Führer and not for the Reich. In the end, they fought for each other, for the right to see another dawn, for the right to save a comrade, for the right to remain human when everything around them had become the kingdom of the beast. This story is not about victory or defeat. It is a reminder that even the quietest, most forgotten act of valor leaves its mark on the universe. It remains in the walls, in the earth, in the collective memory, even if not a single line is written about it. And as long as we tell stories like these forgotten heroes live on.